December 11th, 1943, the Italian mountains groaned under endless artillery. The slopes of Monte Cassino were swallowed by a wet, colorless fog that muffled sound and twisted direction. Private First Class Benjamin Sosi pressed his body into the frozen mud, breathing through his teeth, feeling the tremor of distant tanks crawling up the valley. Every few seconds, the air cracked with the sharp whistle of incoming 88mm shells. Then the ground shook as earth and stone erupted around him. He couldn't see the enemy. No one could. Through the narrow eye of his Springfield M1903A4 rifle scope, he saw nothing but a swirling wall of gray. Somewhere beyond that fog, German artillery observers were calling precise coordinates, walking their fire up the hillside toward his company. One correction at a time. One explosion closer with each call. Eagle 6 to Hawkeye, give me coordinates or pull back immediately. The radio hissed and popped beside him. Captain Miller's voice carried a strain that no static could hide. He was watching his men die blind. Sosi's spotter, Corporal William Davis, wiped condensation off his binoculars, useless against the mist. "We're shooting ghosts out here," he muttered. "We don't even know where the hell they are." Sosi didn't answer. His heartbeat was slow, steady. Beneath the chaos, he felt the world breathing the faint tremor of tank treads, the rhythm of distant fire. To him, noise and light were part of the same language, and right now that language was screaming for help. Another shell landed close, too close. The concussion slammed into the earth, showering them with dirt and jagged stone. Davis cursed and ducked lower. The radio crackled again. "Hawkeye, respond." Sosi keyed the handset, his Navajo accent softened by years of English schooling. "Negative on pullback," he whispered. "I can fix this." He slid his rifle closer, its barrel slick with mud, and reached into the inner pocket of his field jacket. Inside was a small canvas pouch. Forbidden, personal, and secret. Inside that pouch, a handful of glass discs wrapped in cloth clinked softly together. Davis turned, eyes wide. "What the hell are you doing?" "Trying something." "Something?" Now, a shell burst 50 yards downhill, the blast flattening the grass and throwing dust into the air. "We've got less than 10 minutes before they walk the artillery right on top of us," Davis shouted over the ringing in his ears. Sosi's hands moved with deliberate calm, unthreading the scope's locking ring, unscrewing the ocular housing. The cold metal stung his fingers, but he didn't hesitate. Each movement was practiced, almost ritualistic. "You can't take that apart here," Davis hissed. "That's a direct violation of the manual." Sosi finished quietly. "The manual doesn't see through fog." He pulled out one of the thin glass discs. Even through the dim light, Davis noticed the faint tint a strange amber hue. The edge was chipped, clearly scavenged from something not military issue. "Where did you get that?" "Naples," Sosi murmured. "From a bombed-out camera shop." Davis stared at him, half terrified, half fascinated. "You're gonna get us court-martialed, man." Sosi didn't look up. "Only if it doesn't work." He slipped the disc into the scope tube, followed by a tiny copper plate punctured by a single pinhole. His fingers moved like a craftsman shaping silver, not a soldier assembling a weapon. Somewhere deep in memory, he could hear his grandfather's voice in Navajo, "See what hides between the seen and unseen." When the last ring clicked back into place, he pressed the scope to his eye. At first, nothing. Just the same wall of fog. Then, faintly, as he adjusted the focus, shadows began to form. Not shapes of men exactly, but warmth, movement, contrast. A different spectrum of vision born from scavenged glass and instinct. Davis was still cursing softly when Sosi whispered, "I have them." "You what?" 400 yards. Stone wall by the road. 3 heat signatures. "Heat signatures," Davis echoed, incredulous. "You're seeing things that aren't." The crack of Sosi's rifle cut him off. Then another, and another. Each shot rang like punctuation in the smothering silence of the fog. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, through the haze, the distant thunder of German artillery faltered one gun, then another, until the hillside fell eerily quiet. The only sound left was the whisper of wind moving through the valley. Davis stared at him. "What did you just do?" Sosi exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. "I stopped them." For the first time in 3 days, the shells ceased. The fog still hung thick, but inside it, something invisible had changed, not the weather, but the balance of power. Up on that frozen slope near Monte Cassino, a young Navajo soldier had just bent the laws of optics, and perhaps of destiny, to see what no one else could. He didn't know it yet. But the moment he pulled that trigger, he had invented the first step toward a technology that would change warfare forever. And it all began in the fog. Benjamin Sosi was born there in 1921, in a small hogan near Chinle, a circle of mud and cedar logs baked hard by the Sunday. His first light wasn't electric or artificial. It was the copper dawn rising over sandstone cliffs, the shimmer of heat bending the horizon. To the Navajo, light wasn't just brightness. It was spirit. It carried meaning, memory, and presence. His grandfather, a weathered man who had once scouted for the U.S. cavalry in the dying days of the 19th century, was the first to teach him how to see, not to look to see. He'd take the boy into the mesas at dawn, kneeling low beside animal tracks, teaching him how to read the earth's language. "The white man's eyes see what is easy," he'd say in Navajo. "You must see what hides between light and shadow. That's where truth lives." Benjamin learned that even a footprint had temperature. The stone still warm from a rabbit's leap, the faint change of air above disturbed soil, everything radiated information if you knew how to perceive it. He didn't have books. His education came from light itself, the reflection of stars on dry riverbeds, the heat dancing on canyon walls, the slow change of color across a day. He could tell the time from the shadow of a cactus needle and predict weather by the tone of sunlight on rock. That was his classroom. The desert was his laboratory. Then one winter morning in 1929, 2 men in dark suits arrived from the government. They didn't speak Navajo, but their message was clear enough. The boy would go to a boarding school in Flagstaff. For his own good, they said, to learn English, to become American. He was 8 when they took him. At the school, they cut his hair, washed him in bleach water, and replaced his name, Hastian Atsa, man who sees the heat, with Benjamin. He was told to stop speaking Navajo. Each time he slipped, they beat him with a ruler across the knuckles. They told him light was measured in wavelengths. That color was refraction, that shadow was absence, that the sun was a ball of burning gas. And he listened, quietly, absorbing every word. But in his mind, he kept his grandfather's lessons alive. At night, he'd sneak out of the dormitory, climb onto the roof, and study the moonlight as it changed through thin clouds. He noticed how even when light disappeared, warmth remained a faint trace on the skin. It fascinated him. One teacher, a tall man with wire glasses named Dr. Harold Williams, noticed the strange intensity in the boy's eyes. Williams taught basic physics to a class that mostly slept through it except Benjamin. When the doctor demonstrated refraction using a prism and a candle flame, Benjamin interrupted him politely. "Light doesn't always split the same way, sir. It depends on the air. And the heat." Williams blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" Benjamin pointed toward the classroom window. "Out there, near noon, you can see heat make the road dance. That's light bending. Not because of glass, because of air." The teacher stared at him, then smiled. "You're absolutely right, Benjamin. That's called mirage. Very good observation." From that day, Williams let him stay after class, giving him old lenses and scraps of glass to play with. Benjamin built crude telescopes and mirrors out of scavenged parts. He wasn't trying to make anything he was chasing understanding. He wanted to know how light behaved when it was blocked, when it bent, when it passed through heat. By the time he graduated in 1939, he could explain diffraction and refraction better than most teachers. Yet his explanations always carried something older than science, a sense that light was alive, that it spoke if you knew how to listen. He returned home that summer, taller, quieter, his eyes sharper than ever. The reservation hadn't changed, but he had. He worked beside his father, a silversmith, shaping metal into mirrors and jewelry, fascinated by how silver caught light differently from copper or stone. The patterns he carved shimmered in the dusk, reflecting more than beauty, they reflected understanding. One evening, as they worked, his father looked at him and said, "Your hands make things the old way, but your mind works like the new world. That's dangerous and powerful." Benjamin smiled faintly. "I think they can live together." He didn't know yet how true that would become. 2 years later, news from far away reached the desert Pearl Harbor. The world changed overnight. Radios crackled in trading posts, and men gathered to listen as America went to war. For many Navajo, it was complicated. This was a country that had tried to erase them. But Benjamin felt something stir inside him, a chance to serve, to prove that seeing differently didn't make you less American. He left for the recruiter's office the next morning, wearing his father's old hat and carrying nothing but a small pouch of desert stones for luck. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the humidity clung to his skin like a wet blanket. The soldiers laughed at his accent, his quietness, the way he seemed to notice things no one else did. But on the rifle range, he outshot them all. His instructors said it was uncanny, hitting moving targets in crosswind, through heat mirage, at dusk. When asked how he did it, he simply said, "The air speaks to the light." They laughed. He didn't. They would remember that phrase later, long after the laughter stopped, when his impossible shot through fog saved hundreds of men on a hill in Italy. For now, he was just another private, quiet, strange, brilliant waiting for the world to give him a reason to break its rules. And soon, that reason would come. The red dirt of Arizona had made him calm. The fields of Georgia tried to burn that calm away. Fort Benning in 1942 was a furnace not just from the southern heat, but from the noise, the drill sergeants, the insults that flew like bullets. They called him Chief, Ghost Eyes, Sandwalker. Most of the time, Benjamin Sosi didn't answer. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than anger. His rifle spoke for him. The first time they took him to the range, Sergeant Harlow barked. "Targets, 300 yards. Fire when ready." Bang! The bullet hit dead center. "Lucky shot," someone muttered. Bang! Second target. Same hole. By the 5th round, the sergeant lowered his binoculars and just stared. "You been taught by the Army before, Private?" "No, Sia." "Then how the hell you see wind drift like that?" Sosi simply said, "The air talks if you listen long enough." The others laughed, of course. They always did. But by the end of that week, laughter turned to respect, then quiet curiosity, and eventually something like fear. He was promoted to marksman in record time, but the attention it brought was double-edged. In the mess hall, some men wouldn't sit with him. Rumors spread that he used Indian tricks, that he could smell Germans in the dark. A corporal even nailed a feather to his bunk, calling him war shaman. Sosi just took it down and folded it carefully. He wasn't here to fight soldiers. He was here to understand war. When word spread that the Marines were recruiting Navajo speakers for their secret Code Talker program, one of the officers asked him if he wanted to join. "You speak the tongue, right? We could use that." But Benjamin shook his head. "They want my words. I want to use my eyes." Instead, he volunteered for the newly formed Scout Sniper School, the most unforgiving branch of training the Army offered. It was a place where patience mattered more than muscle, where a heartbeat could mean life or death. At Camp Perry, the instructors taught them camouflage, concealment, and precision under stress. Sosi already knew those things. He'd been practicing them since he was 8 years old in the desert. He didn't need the textbook to tell him how to become invisible. He'd learned that in a world that refused to see him. On the 3rd day of field tests, he lay motionless in the weeds, while an instructor walked past him at arm's length, never realizing the Navajo soldier was lying beneath his boot prints. When Sosi finally stood up, the other recruits stared half in awe, half in disbelief. "God damn," one whispered. "He just disappeared." The lead instructor, Captain Ryland, called him aside. "You're not like the others, Private. You see the field differently. I could use a man like that." "Yes, sir." Ryland lowered his voice. "You ever kill before?" Sosi paused. "Only what I had to eat." The captain studied his face for a long time, then nodded. That's the kind of honesty that survives a war. By autumn, he was assigned to the 34th Infantry Division, set to deploy to Italy. On his personnel file, someone had written in pencil, "Unorthodox field instincts." Extraordinary spatial perception. Unpredictable, but effective. When he boarded the ship for Naples, the ocean stretched endlessly around them, gray, cold, alive. He stood at the railing one night, the sea mist settling on his face. Davis, the same man who would later spot for him at Cassino, came up beside him. "You ever think about home?" Davis asked. "Always. You believe in luck?" "No," Sosi said quietly. "Just preparation meeting a chance." Davis chuckled. "You sound like a damn philosopher." "Maybe. But philosophy doesn't stop bullets." They both laughed softly. The kind of laugh that only comes from men who don't know if they'll see another year. When they landed in Italy, it wasn't like the posters. Naples was rubble. Smoke rose from every street. The people looked half alive, the children barefoot among ruins. War smelled of burnt rubber and meat. Sosi watched it all with a steady calm. War was just another form of weather, unpredictable, deadly, but understandable if you knew how to read it. He began sketching in a small notebook he kept hidden under his tunic. Sketches of terrain, wind patterns, reflections on metal, the way fog moved through valleys. The others thought it was superstition. It was, in fact, science, a Navajo version of field optics. Every night before sleep, he'd draw one more line, one more observation. He wasn't documenting death, he was documenting light. Captain Ryland noticed. "What are you writing, soldier?" "Just lessons, sir." "About what?" "About what the air teaches." Ryland raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. Some men prayed before battle. Others wrote letters home. Benjamin Sosi wrote about light. By November 1943, as the 34th prepared to move toward Monte Cassino, command began asking for volunteers, men willing to scout under fog and artillery. Visibility was near zero. Casualties were mounting. Sosi stepped forward before the officer even finished speaking. Davis groaned beside him. "You trying to get yourself killed?" Sosi adjusted his rifle strap. "No, I'm trying to see." The officer smiled faintly. "Then, Private, you're the man for the job." They didn't know it yet, but this quiet Navajo from Arizona, the one they mocked for seeing ghosts, was about to make the battlefield itself blink. He wasn't born to follow orders. He was born to question what others called impossible. And at Monte Cassino, that question would save hundreds of lives and rewrite what it meant to see in war. January 17th, 1944, Monte Cassino. The mountain looked like a ghost, a shadow made of smoke and rain. For 2 weeks, the 34th Infantry Division had been clawing uphill against a fortress that wasn't supposed to exist. The Germans had turned every boulder, every monastery wall, every cave into a machine gun nest. The Allies called it the Gate to Rome. But to the men on the ground, it was hell made of stone. Private First Class Benjamin Sosi lay behind a low ridge, his face streaked with mud. Next to him, Corporal William Davis peered through a pair of binoculars fogged with condensation. Below them, American units were trying to cross a river that wasn't even supposed to be a river, just melted snow turned to mud, churning brown and deep enough to drown a jeep. Artillery thundered from both sides. The mountain answered every Allied shell with 3 of its own. "Visibility 0, Davis muttered, wiping his lenses uselessly. "It's like shooting blindfolded." Sosi didn't reply. His cheek rested against the cold stock of his rifle, the same Springfield M1903A4 that had followed him from the desert to Europe. But his scope that was different now. Modified. Illegal. Alive. He had spent nights perfecting it in secret. A scavenged film lens from a destroyed German camera. A thin copper aperture from an aircraft compass. A sliver of tinted glass he'd cut from a shattered truck headlight. To most men, it looked like junk. To him, it was evolution. The brass didn't know about it. The Army didn't care how he saw, only what he hit. "Command says hold fire until visual confirmation," Davis whispered. "But I don't even see shapes." Sosi adjusted the tiny copper dial near the eyepiece. The world shifted, shadows came alive, light thickened, and faint heat outlines began to appear through the mist, not clear, but enough. He saw movement men, not rocks crawling behind a wall 600 yards uphill. He spoke softly. Machine gun nest, north slope, 3 men, 2 working the MG-40, 2-1 spotting. Davis froze. How the hell can you see that? Because they don't know how not to glow, Sosi said, voice flat. Every man gives off heat, even in fog. He didn't explain the optics, he couldn't. Not in words the army would understand. To him, it wasn't infrared. It was light that remembered warmth. He took a slow breath. Exhaled. Fired. The first shot cracked through the still air like a single drumbeat. Then silence. Then panic, a burst of machine gun fire. Wild and directionless. Sosi shifted aim. Second shot. The muzzle flash from the MG-42 vanished. Davis grinned, disbelief and relief mixed together. You just took out a nest through a damn cloud. Not a cloud, Sosi said quietly. A mirror. Davis frowned. A what? The fog reflects heat like glass reflects light. You just need to know what angle to look from. Jesus, Davis muttered, shaking his head. You talk like you're teaching science class. Sosi didn't smile. Science keeps me alive. Hours passed. The fog refused to lift. Commanders called off the next push. They couldn't see targets, couldn't call artillery accurately. Units were stalled in the mud, pinned by snipers and machine guns hidden somewhere they couldn't find. That's when the field radio sputtered. Hawkeye, report any visual on German forward positions. We're blind down here. Davis looked at Sosi. You're Hawkeye, remember? You tell them. Sosi keyed the transmitter. This is Hawkeye. I can see them. A pause. Say again? I said I can see them. Coordinates to follow. He read off numbers with quiet precision, his voice steady as gunfire cracked in the distance. The battalion's artillery adjusted and fired. The shells whistled through the fog, hitting exactly where Sosi had called. The hillside lit up with orange flashes, secondary explosions. Ammunition cache. For the first time in days, the enemy's guns went silent. When Davis looked back, he saw Sosi still kneeling, smoke rising from his barrel, calm as if none of it mattered. You realize what you just did? Davis said softly. You gave the whole division eyes. Sosi shrugged. Eyes don't matter if they close when it's dark. That night, the camp buzzed with rumors. Men said some Indian had seen through fog. Others claimed he had mirrors or spirits guiding him. The truth spread faster than orders. Somewhere on that mountain, one man could see what no one else could. When Captain Ryland came to debrief them, he pulled Sosi aside. Private, how exactly are you spotting through zero visibility? Sosi hesitated. The truth was dangerous. I listened to light, sir. Ryland frowned. Cut the poetry. I modified my scope. Just glass and copper, nothing fancy. It helps cut reflection. Modified, Ryland repeated slowly. That's unauthorized. Yes, sir. Then why shouldn't I report you? Sosi looked him dead in the eyes. Because it worked. Ryland studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Keep your secret. But if anyone asks, it's training. Understood? Yes, sir. As Ryland walked away, Davis whispered, You just talked your way out of a court-martial. Sosi shook his head. No, I just talked my way deeper into this war. He looked back up toward the fog-shrouded monastery, the German stronghold still looming above. Somewhere in that gray silence, men were waiting, confident that the mist would protect them. They didn't know that one man down below could already see their breath glowing through the smoke. Tomorrow, they would. Sosi and Davis had been awake for 22 hours. Their fingers were cracked from cold, their stomachs empty. Their bodies pressed so long against wet soil they could no longer feel their knees. The world smelled of cordite and wet stone. Every few minutes, German 88 seconds cracked in the distance. Each shell landing blind but somehow always too close. Command's voice hissed through the radio. Eagle 6 to Hawkeye, report or pull back. Regiment moves in 1 hour. Davis reached for the mic. We got nothing but fog, sir. Visibility 50 yards at best. But Sosi's hand stopped him. Tell them we have a possible solution. 10 minutes. Davis shot him a look halfway between disbelief and anger. Ben, if this is another one of your experiments, it's the only thing left, Sosi said. From inside his jacket, he pulled out the small canvas pouch, the one he'd built from a ration bag and lined with oilcloth to keep the glass dry. He laid out its contents like a surgeon preparing for an operation. 4 discs of colored crystal, a thin sheet of copper with a pinhole cut by hand, a strip of brass wire he'd scavenged from a wrecked radio. "What the hell is that?" Davis asked. "Pieces of a camera from Naples," Sosi said. "A lens, some filters, a copper diaphragm. I've been thinking about the fog. It doesn't block all light, just the kind our eyes know how to use. Maybe I can shift what the scope sees." Davis stared, incredulous. "You're modifying army equipment. In combat. You'll hang for that if it doesn't work. Then it has to work." He unscrewed the rear lens of his Springfield scope, his fingers steady despite the trembling cold. He slid the copper plate inside, followed by 2 glass filters, 1 amber, 1 dark violet. The pieces clicked into place like they belonged there. Davis checked his watch. "You've got 3 minutes left before Miller starts yelling. Then I'll make it count." Sosi reassembled the scope, pressed it against his eye, and let the world change. At first, it was chaos, shifting colors, blurred halos, streaks of light like underwater fire. Then, as he adjusted the angle, the haze began to thin. The fog wasn't gone, it had just become transparent. He could see faint outlines, heat bleeding through cold air. Figures, movement. 3 of them. 400 yards, he whispered. Stone wall near the road junction. German observers. 1 has a radio. Davis looked through his binoculars and saw nothing but gray. "You're guessing." "No," Sosi said flatly. "I'm seeing." He adjusted wind and elevation, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked like lightning. Silence. Then, faintly, a body fell against stone, a sound only a hunter would recognize. "First target down," Sosi murmured. Davis's disbelief turned to unease. "Are you sure?" Crack. Second shot. Second man, left flank, down. Before Davis could respond, the radio snapped alive again. Eagle 6 to Hawkeye German fire mission just went silent mid-transmission. Confirm status? Sosi kept his eye to the scope. 3 observers eliminated. Sector clear. There was a long pause. Then, "Roger that, Hawkeye. Maintain overwatch. Regiment moves in 30. Davis sat back, staring at the fog. "Ben." The artillery stopped. Sosi didn't answer. He was already scanning for more shapes, more ghosts hiding in the gray. Minutes later, he spotted another glimmer heat against cold, a rifle barrel catching warmth. "Tumore. Samerigge." Crack. Crack. 5 shots in total, each one deliberate, quiet, final. And then the valley was silent, truly silent for the first time in days. When the 42nd Infantry Regiment advanced at 0800, they expected a slaughter. Instead, they moved through empty fields, untouched by shells. German artillery positions lay abandoned, their observers dead. The fog still hung heavy, but for once, it belonged to the Americans. From the ridgeline, Davis watched the movement through his binoculars, still half convinced it was all luck. "You just saved a regiment, Ben." Sosi didn't look up from his rifle. "I saved what I could see." Davis exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "The Army's gonna have a heart attack when they find out what you did to that scope." "They won't find out," Sosi replied. "Not if it keeps working. But word travels faster than light in a war zone." By evening, the story had spread through every foxhole how an Indian sniper had seen through fog, how he'd shot ghosts out of the mist. Some called him the fog breaker. Others said he used Navajo magic. Sosi didn't correct any of them. Let them believe whatever made sense. The truth was stranger. He had built something that shouldn't have worked. Something the manual said was impossible. Something that made the invisible visible at the price of breaking every rule in the Army's book. That night, as the fires burned low and the valley went quiet, Davis turned to him. "You ever think maybe you changed something bigger than this battle?" Sosi looked toward the fog still drifting over the river. "Maybe," he said softly. "But change isn't always welcome." He could already feel the storm coming, questions, inspections, orders, punishment. But for now, the mountain was quiet. Men were alive. And the man who saw differently had turned the tide of a battle no one could see. Tomorrow, the officers would demand to know how he'd done it. Tomorrow, the army would try to understand what he had built. But tonight, Benjamin Sosi, the boy who once studied moonlight on sandstone, finally understood his grandfather's words. You must learn to see what hides between the seen and unseen. He had. And it had changed everything. By the afternoon of December 11th, 1943, the fog over Monte Cassino began to thin not by weather, but by fire. The 42nd Regiment had pushed farther than anyone expected. German radio traffic was in chaos. American artillery, guided by the coordinates Sosi had whispered into his field radio, shattered enemy positions that had held for weeks. And word spread like wildfire. Some Navajo kid shot through fog, one lieutenant muttered at battalion HQ, said he could see heat. By nightfall, the rumors had reached the division commander. And that meant paperwork, questions, and a very uneasy captain named James Miller. When Miller reached Sosi's hillside position, his expression was unreadable, caught somewhere between pride and suspicion. "Private Sosi," he said curtly. "Pack up your rifle. You're coming with me." Davis stiffened. "Sir, what's this about?" "Regimental debriefing," Miller replied. "And if I were you, Corporal, I'd make sure your story matches his." They followed the captain down the slope, the mud sucking at their boots. The valley below was littered with smoking craters, graves for men they'd never meet. Sosi walked silently, rifle slung over his shoulder, the modified scope still warm from use. When they reached headquarters, a bombed-out farmhouse, the air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Around the table sat Colonel Raymond Kendall, Division Intelligence Major Whitaker, and a man in a clean uniform that didn't belong. His insignia marked him as Civilian Liaison Washington. "Sit," Kendall ordered. Sosi obeyed. The table was cluttered with field reports, spent shell casings, and a single black coffee cup trembling slightly in the colonel's hand. "Private Sosi," Kendall began, his voice slow and measured. "According to your captain and spotter, you claim to have identified and eliminated multiple German observers during zero visibility conditions. Correct?" "Yes, sir." "How?" Sosi hesitated. The silence stretched. "Sir," Davis interrupted, "if I may." Kendall raised a hand. "You'll get your turn, Corporal." He leaned forward. "Private, we've seen the bodies. The shots were clean, one per target. We also found something else." He gestured toward the table. A soldier stepped forward, carrying Sosi's rifle. "The scope," Kendall said. "Our armorer opened it up. You care to explain why there's a copper disc and glass shards inside government equipment?" Miller looked uneasy. Davis froze. Sosi met the colonel's eyes. "Because it works." The room went quiet. Whitaker's voice cut in, cold and precise. "You are aware, Private, that modifying standard-issue equipment in combat is a direct violation of military regulation, punishable by court-martial?" "Yes, sir." "Then why do it?" Sosi took a slow breath. "Because the regulations couldn't see through fog." Kendall's jaw tightened, a mix of irritation and something else. "Respect." Whitaker pressed on. "Where did you acquire the materials?" "Naples, sir. A bombed-out camera shop. The owner was dead. The glass was different. It filters light. I use copper to focus the heat." Whitaker scoffed. "You expect us to believe you built a thermal sight out of junk?" Before Sosi could answer, the civilian spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, educated. "Actually, Major, it's not impossible. Theoretically, certain crystal combinations can shift infrared wavelengths. Passive detection, no power required." Whitaker frowned. "And you are?" "Dr. Henry Roberts, Ordnance Department, Washington." He turned to Sosi. "Private, may I examine your design?" Sosi nodded. Roberts picked up the scope, peering through the modified lens with growing fascination. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Primitive, but functional. You've built a rudimentary thermal filter." The colonel rubbed his temples. "Doctor, are you telling me this contraption actually works?" Roberts smiled faintly. "I'm saying, Colonel, that this soldier accomplished in a foxhole what our labs in Maryland have been failing to do for 2 years." Kendall leaned back, exhaling. "So what now?" We can't exactly court-martial a man for saving a regiment. Whitaker bristled. We can't let soldiers think they can alter equipment whenever they feel like it either. Then maybe, Kendall said, we make this one official. He turned to Sosi. Private, as of this moment. You're on classified assignment. Your equipment is now designated Experimental Field Optic T-43. As far as anyone else knows, you were testing it under orders. Whitaker blinked. That's falsifying. That's winning wars, Major, Kendall interrupted. Roberts nodded approvingly. We'll send formal documentation. The Ordnance Department can study it later. Kendall looked back at Sosi. Understand something, son. What you did broke the rules. But if I hang you for it, I'll have to explain to Washington why breaking rules just saved 400 men. Sosi met his gaze evenly. Then I'll keep breaking them, sir, as long as it saves lives. Kendall's lips twitched almost a smile. Good answer. Dismissed. Outside, the cold air felt lighter. Davis exhaled hard. Jesus, Ben. I thought they were going to shoot you. Sosi adjusted his rifle strap. So did I. What happens now? They'll want more, Sosi said simply. More scopes, more results, more questions. He looked out across the valley where the fog was finally clearing, sunlight breaking through in shards of gold. Below, the regiment moved forward alive because one man refused to obey an order that made no sense. Davis followed his gaze. You think the army will ever admit what you did? Doesn't matter, Sosi said quietly. The mountain remembers. That night, as he cleaned his rifle by the dim light of a lantern, Sosi thought of his grandfather's voice. The white man's eyes only see what's easy to see. You must learn to see what hides between. He smiled faintly. He had done exactly that, and for the first time, the army had been forced to look through his eyes. The next morning, Monte Cassino's slopes were scarred, black-twisted metal, splintered stone, and the silence of a battlefield briefly catching its breath. The German guns had fallen quiet for the first time in weeks. In a small command tent pitched near the shattered Abbey Road, Private First Class Benjamin Sosi sat across from Dr. Henry Roberts, the civilian scientist who had seen the impossible through a scavenged piece of glass. On the table between them lay the disassembled scope, its tiny components spread out on a white cloth like surgical instruments. A copper disc, 2 shards of amber-tinted glass, a brass pin ring bent by hand. Roberts was turning the pieces over with fascination. You understand, Roberts said, that what you built here defies half of the Army's optical manuals. Sosi gave a quiet smile. Maybe they're looking at the wrong light. Roberts chuckled. You sound like a philosopher, not a soldier. Where I come from, Sosi said, you learn both if you want to live. Outside, trucks rumbled as medics hauled the wounded to aid stations. The mountain fog still clung to the ridges, but the air smelled different now, like wet iron and victory. You called it seeing heat, Roberts continued. You understand the physics behind that? Sosi paused. I understand what I see. Rocks hold the sun after it sets. Men leave warmth behind them. Light changes when it hits moving air. I don't need a book to tell me that. Roberts leaned back in his chair, studying him. You know, the Ordnance Department spent 2 years trying to build a thermal sight with power cells the size of a typewriter. You made one that fits in a rifle tube. Sosi shrugged. You use power, I use balance. The glass does the work, not me. The scientist's eyes narrowed, intrigued. You shifted the light, didn't you? The crystals, they filter certain wavelengths, narrow the visible band until it shows heat contrast. That's why you could see through fog. Sosi nodded slowly. Fog scatters light, but not warmth. You just have to convince the eye to see the difference. Roberts let out a low whistle. You convince glass to bend light differently with nothing but scrap metal and instinct. He smiled. The Army doesn't realize it yet, but they're sitting on the future. 2 hours later, Colonel Kendall summoned them both to the operations tent. The smell of coffee and cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. Gentlemen, Kendall said, the brass at 5th Army HQ just received our report. They want results duplicated for the January offensive. Doctor, I'm assigning you 2 technicians. Private Sosi, you'll supervise the rebuilds. Sosi frowned. Sir, I'm not an engineer. You are now, Kendall replied flatly. Roberts grinned. Welcome to Research and Development, soldier. By nightfall, they had set up a makeshift workshop in a captured barn. Sosi worked by lantern light, the shadows of shattered rafters stretching across the dirt floor. Roberts took notes furiously as the Navajo soldier explained his process, a blend of scientific principle and tribal wisdom that made the engineers scratch their heads. I angle the copper plate 3 degrees downward, Sosi explained, so the heat signatures rise naturally into the lens. You're aligning to atmospheric gradient, Roberts murmured, scribbling. You figured that out without instruments? I figured it out from hawks, Sosi said simply. They fly higher when the rocks hold heat. Same principle. The 2 Army technicians exchanged glances. One whispered, "This guy's either a genius or crazy." Roberts didn't look up. "Genius," he said. "Absolutely." For 3 nights straight, they worked without rest. They cannibalized broken optics from field cameras, ground lenses using sandpaper from vehicle toolkits, and cut thin copper sheets from discarded radio panels. By the 3rd morning, there were 4 scopes on the table, rough, imperfect, but functional. Roberts tested them at dawn, aiming across the valley where mist still clung to the ground. Through the modified optics, the ghostly shapes of soldiers appeared clear as day. He turned to Sosi. "They work. Every damn one of them works." Sosi only nodded, expression unreadable. "Then the others can see now too." When Colonel Kendall arrived to inspect, he lifted one of the scopes and peered through. "Good Lord," he whispered. The fog-covered hills shimmered with faint heat outlines like spirits walking between worlds. "Congratulations, gentlemen," he said finally. "You just changed the rules of visibility." Whitaker, the intelligence officer, wasn't as impressed. "We're playing with something untested. The science isn't verified. If these scopes fail in combat," Roberts cut him off. "If they fail, soldiers die blind. If they work, we see first. You choose." Whitaker muttered under his breath but didn't argue further. Kendall clapped a hand on Sosi's shoulder. "Private, I don't know if you're a scientist, a sorcerer, or both, but the 5th Army owes you a drink." Sosi allowed a rare smile. "I'll take quiet over whiskey, sir." The colonel laughed. "Then you'll hate this next part. I'm sending you back out there. I need real combat data. You and your team will field test these scopes during the next push." Sosi's smile faded. "Understood, sir." As he cleaned his rifle that night, Davis watched him silently. "You realize you just gave the Army something they'll never give back." Sosi didn't look up. "Light belongs to everyone. They just forgot how to see it." He slid the newly modified scope into place, the copper ring glinting faintly in the lamplight. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we find out if it really sees through death." The night of January 10th, 1944, began like a whisper and ended like thunder. The Gustav line was alive again, the kind of darkness that eats sound, where every breath feels borrowed. The fog had returned, thick as a shroud, and the mountains of southern Italy seemed to hum under distant German guns. Private First Class Benjamin Sosi lay prone beside Corporal Davis on a frozen ridge overlooking the Leary Valley. Below them, the 351st Infantry Regiment moved in silence, navigating mud-choked mule trails that wound through the dead pines. Every few minutes, the valley flickered a German flare, a muzzle flash, or the slow arc of a shell screaming blind into the mist. Sosi adjusted the scope, his scope, the new model, the one built in the barn workshop with salvaged glass, copper, and 2 weeks of restless hands. Through the lens, the world looked alive again. The valley glowed faintly in hues invisible to ordinary eyes, warm silhouettes flickering against cold rock, spectral outlines of men crouching behind walls, machine gun nests pulsing with faint heat. "They're waiting for us," Sosi whispered. Davis, still relying on his standard binoculars, saw nothing but black. "How many?" "2 teams on the ridge. One heavy MG nest behind that church wall. I can see the barrel heat." "Christ," Davis muttered. "I believe you." Again. He didn't have to anymore. Everyone believed now. The regiment had already seen what Sosi's invention could do. During the last fog-bound skirmish, they'd wiped out 3 German positions without losing a single man. Word had reached Fifth Army headquarters, the ghost scopes, they called them. But tonight, they were about to find out how far that ghost could see. At 2,300 hours, Colonel Kendall's voice came through the radio. "Hawkeye, confirm Overwatch ready." "Ready, sir," Sosi answered. "Scouts report enemy machine gun teams dug in on Hill 213. We need those silenced before the 350. First moves. You've got 20 minutes. Sosi chambered around. The metallic click sounded like church bells in the dark. He settled into his rifle, feeling the scope's cool metal against his cheek. 400 yards, he murmured. Slight uphill angle, wind steady. "Copy," Davis said, running the calculations. "Adjust point, 8 mils right. Fire when ready." Through the lens, the night opened like a wound. He saw the first German gunner, a faint orange outline, crouched behind sandbags, his hands hot against the icy ground. Sosi's breath slowed. Crack. The rifle's report echoed off the ridge. A figure slumped backward, the glow dimming instantly. "Hit confirmed," Davis whispered. A second heat signature moved, reaching for the weapon. Crack. Another body fell. Sosi worked the bolt without thought. The scope was an extension of his heartbeat now, the light bending for him alone. He spotted another flare of heat farther up, a radio operator gesturing frantically. Crack. The radio light blinked once and vanished. 3 targets down, MG nest neutralized, Davis reported. "Regiment can move." But before he could key the mic, a flash from below lit the valley tracer fire. German mortars began to cough. The mountains came alive. "They've seen muzzle flash," Davis shouted. "Shift position," Sosi barked. They rolled behind a boulder as a shell burst overhead, showering them with rock. The concussion left Sosi's ears ringing. He raised the scope again, half blinded by smoke. Through the haze, the heat outlines still burned bright. German teams were repositioning, unaware they'd been marked by their own warmth. 3 more. Left flank. Sosi called. Range, 520. Davis glanced at him. "That's pushing it. Then let's push back." Crack, crack, crack. 3 flashes of light, 3 fading glows. Silence again. The valley below erupted in motion, the 351st advancing under cover of the chaos. Rifle fire rolled like thunder, echoed by distant artillery that had once been blind but now fired with precision coordinates Sosi provided. Through the swirling fog, the night looked almost unnatural, the kind of sight a man shouldn't have. Ghosts walking, light bending, death moving unseen. Davis finally exhaled. "You realize what this means, right? You've turned the dark into daylight." Sosi didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his focus, scanning the field one last time. The heat from bodies, the faint glow from spent barrels, all fading now. "The dark was never the enemy," he said quietly. "It's the blindness that kills." By dawn, Hill 213 belonged to the Allies. The regiment's casualty list showed something no one expected. 0 artillery losses, minimal gunfire wounds, total victory. When Colonel Kendall visited their position that afternoon, he looked 10 years older and twice as relieved. "Private Sosi," he said, "I've had generals ask how you did it." Sosi gave the same answer he always did. "I just saw what was there." Kendall laughed, shaking his head. "Well, keep seeing it, son. Washington's sending observers next week. They want to talk to you and Dr. Roberts about formal development. Seems your little experiment's about to become official doctrine." Sosi didn't respond right away. He looked toward the smoking ridge they'd captured and said quietly, "Then I hope they understand what they're asking for." Davis frowned. "What do you mean?" Sosi wiped his hands on his jacket. "When you learn to see everything, you stop being surprised by death. That's not always a gift." The colonel's voice came over the radio again. "Regiment secure. Prepare for redeployment." The mountains were still burning in the distance. The fog had finally lifted, revealing the wreckage of 2 armies and a single sniper whose vision had changed what war looked like. 2 weeks after the night the mountains caught fire, Benjamin Sosi found himself far from the fog and mud of Italy. The army had pulled him from the front and flown him to a place he'd never imagined, an airfield outside Naples, then onward through Casablanca, the Azores, and finally, Washington, D.C. He'd fought his way across a continent, only to end up inside polished marble halls, where people in pressed uniforms and tailored suits spoke a language colder than the fog he'd once conquered. Dr. Henry Roberts was waiting at the Pentagon's north entrance, wearing the same rumpled expression of a man who'd spent more time in labs than in sunlight. "Welcome to the belly of the beast," Roberts muttered, guiding Sosi through the echoing corridors. "They want to see your scope." Sosi nodded, carrying the rifle case that held the thing everyone suddenly wanted to own, but no one wanted to understand. Inside a conference room lined with American flags, a half-dozen officers sat around an oak table. At its head was Brigadier General Clarence H. Dalton, head of the Army's Ordnance Research Division. "Private Sosi," Dalton began, voice clipped and authoritative. "You've been commended for extraordinary initiative under combat conditions. Your actions near Monte Cassino reportedly saved hundreds of men. But we're not here for medals. We're here for clarity." He gestured to the table. "Put it down." Sosi opened the case. The scope lay there, gleaming faintly under the fluorescent lights. Dalton leaned forward, his face inches from the scratched metal tube. "So this is what all the noise is about." Robert spoke up. "With respect, General, that noise is the first passive thermal sight ever used successfully in combat." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "And you're certain it wasn't a fluke? Some quirk of fog and luck?" Robert's tone sharpened. "Sir, we duplicated the effect 4 times in field conditions. We've documented every variable." Dalton ignored him and turned to Sosi. "Private, tell me, how did you do it?" Sosi hesitated. "I combined crystal glass from a camera lens with copper. It bends the light, shows heat instead of reflection." Dalton frowned. "You mean you built this from trash?" "Yes, sir." "And it works?" "Yes, sir." The general sat back, expression unreadable. "You realize modifying government equipment without authorization is a court-martial offense?" "Yes, sir." "And yet—" Dalton's gaze softened, almost reluctantly. "It's the kind of offense that wins wars." The officers murmured among themselves. One colonel asked, "Could we reproduce it industrially?" Roberts nodded. "In theory, yes. But we'd need specialized lenses, copper thin enough to—" Dalton raised a hand. "Enough theory, gentlemen. You've seen what happens when soldiers get their hands on something that changes visibility. That power doesn't just shift tactics, it rewrites them." He turned to Sosi. "Do you understand what you've made, son?" Sosi glanced at the scope. "A way to see." Dalton shook his head. "A way to control who sees." The room fell silent. Later that evening, Roberts and Sosi walked along the mall outside the Pentagon. Snow fell softly through the D.C. glow. "They're not sure what to do with you," Roberts said. "Half the brass want to weaponize it. The other half want to bury it before the Germans catch wind." Sosi's breath clouded in the cold. "They think seeing is power." Roberts gave a faint smile. "Isn't it?" Sosi looked away. "Where I come from, seeing means responsibility. If you can see what others can't, you protect them, not rule them." Roberts said nothing. The scientist knew he was standing beside a man who saw the world not as light or shadow, but as something in between, something the Army couldn't catalog or command. The next morning, Sosi and Roberts were escorted to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. There, in a sterile lab filled with test equipment, engineers in white coats carefully dismantled the scope. When they finally reached the inner chamber, the room went still. Inside the tube lay the copper plate perfectly hand-filed, pierced with a pinhole no larger than a grain of sand, and the amber crystals mounted with wax. Primitive, yet impossibly precise. One technician whispered, "This shouldn't work." Another replied softly, "And yet it does." Dalton, watching through the glass partition, murmured to Roberts, "Get everything you can out of it. Then classify it so deep no one touches it without my signature." Roberts frowned. "You can't hide this forever." Dalton's jaw tightened. "If the Germans get their hands on it, they'll own the night. We can't risk that." The words hit Sosi like a blow. The invention born in desperation, the thing that saved his brothers in arms, was now too dangerous to exist. That evening, in Robert's quarters, Sosi quietly reassembled the scope from memory, building a second copy before the lab could lock away the first. He handed it to the scientist. If they hide one, let them. But keep this. Someday someone will need to see again. Roberts looked at him, understanding the risk. You're breaking protocol again. Sosi gave a faint smile. Wouldn't be the first time. When he left Aberdeen the next morning, snow still falling, he carried nothing but his rifle, his orders, and the quiet knowledge that somewhere, locked in a government vault, sat the truth. Washington called it experimental optical research. The soldiers who'd lived through Monte Cassino called it something else. The day the fog lost. Decades passed before anyone spoke Benjamin Sosi's name again inside the halls of the U.S. Army. The scope, that impossible, rule-breaking tube of glass and copper, had been locked in an evidence vault at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, filed under confidential experimental optics, field prototype number T-43. For years, it gathered dust. But progress never forgets. In 1955, as American troops waded through the rice paddies of Korea and military engineers struggled with the limitations of night combat, an aging technician rediscovered Sosi's scope. The report he filed was brief but world-changing. Passive heat, differential imaging observed without power source. Origin: Italy, 1943. By the time the Vietnam War erupted a decade later, his invention, reborn as the AN divided by PVS-2 Starlight scope, was saving American lives once again. Through it, men could see silhouettes in monsoon rain, through humidity and darkness. And though the new devices were electronic, every engineer who studied their history found the same impossible origin: a field modification created by a Navajo scout sniper who refused to die blind in the fog. Sosi himself had returned to Arizona long before the Army remembered him. He lived quietly on the reservation, raising 3 children and running a small optical repair shop in Gallup, New Mexico. When customers asked how a man from the desert learned so much about glass and light, he would simply say, "War teaches you what you really need to see." To most, he was just another veteran trying to live in peace. But once every few years, a black government sedan would pull up in front of his workshop. Men in plain suits would step out, polite but nervous, carrying notebooks stamped Department of Defense, classified. They would spend hours talking with him about refraction, spectral shift, and the behavior of light and heat. He never asked for money or credit. When one engineer asked him why, Sosi just smiled. "Because you're building it for the same reason I did," he said. "So someone gets to go home." It wasn't until 1992, nearly 50 years after Monte Cassino, that the Army finally declassified the report. That summer, under the domed ceiling of the Pentagon Auditorium, Benjamin Sosi stood once again in uniform. His silver hair brushed his collar, his ribbons faded with age, but his posture was still that of a man who had once faced a valley full of death and seen through it. A general stepped forward and read aloud the citation. For exceptional courage, ingenuity, and technological innovation under fire, Private First Class Benjamin Sosi demonstrated principles that redefined the science of battlefield optics and saved countless lives during the Italian campaign of 1943. The applause came slowly, at first hesitant, reverent, then built into a standing ovation. For the first time, the Army publicly acknowledged the Navajo sniper who had seen what no man was supposed to. Dr. Henry Roberts, long since retired, was there in the front row. When Sosi stepped down from the stage, Roberts took his hand. His eyes were wet. "You changed everything, Ben," he said softly. Sosi smiled. "I just changed how we looked at it." A week later, at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, a new exhibit opened. From Fog to Fire: The Birth of Modern Battlefield Vision. Inside a glass case sat Sosi's original scope, its copper still tarnished, its lens cloudy with age. Next to it was a plaque that read, "Field Modified, Springfield M. 1903. A quattroscope Monte Cassino, Italy, 1943. This device represents the first documented passive thermal sight in military history. developed under combat conditions by Private First Class Benjamin Sosi, U.S. Army. On the wall above it hung two photographs, one black and white, one in full color. The first showed a young Navajo soldier lying prone on a fog-covered ridge. The second showed a modern U.S. sniper in the Kuwaiti desert, using a thermal imaging scope that could trace its lineage directly to that moment in Italy. Different wars, same principle, the ability to see what others cannot. When Sosi passed away in 2001 at the age of 80, his children found something tucked inside an old cigar box beneath his workbench, a set of hand-drawn diagrams and a small note, written in both English and Navajo. From the earth comes the power to see clearly. Knowledge belongs to all who use it wisely. He was buried with full military honors, his coffin draped not only with the American flag but also a traditional Navajo blanket. In his eulogy, his old spotter, William Davis, spoke through tears. He didn't invent a weapon. He invented a way to see life and to save it. Today, at Fort Benning's U.S. Army Sniper School, instructors still tell the story of the Navajo scout who bent light to save a regiment. Recruits listen as they pass around a photo of Sosi's original scope, crude, improvised, and perfect. The lesson isn't about technology. It's about courage. About breaking rules when rules don't save lives. About trusting what you see, even when no one else believes it's there. Because every battlefield still has its fog of smoke, confusion, or fear, and sometimes it takes one man to cut through it. In the end, Private First Class Benjamin Sosi didn't just build a scope. He built a bridge between worlds, between ways of thinking, between light and darkness. And through it, he reminded us that courage isn't just pulling the trigger. Sometimes, it's daring to look through the fog and to believe in what you see. Thank you for watching this story of innovation, courage, and vision. If you were in Sosi's place, under that fog at Monte Cassino, would you have risked everything to see what others couldn't? Tell us what you think below, and don't forget to share this story so the legacy of the man who saw through the fog is never forgotten.